This should be the theme song for a lot of you that want to find out how to protest about rising costs and particularly taxes and fees as we struggle to make the budget by maybe encumbering us a little bit more with taxes. So we got to tell our legislators in the next couple of weeks, hey, I can't go for that. And the best way to find out what you can and can't go for is to get a good, fresh look at what's going on in that big square building. And we're fortunate once again to have with us Representative Aaron Johanson, who is here as the minority leader to sort of give us a heads up on some of the things that are going on. I told you, most of you probably read the op-eds this morning by both UH professor emeritus and a bottling guy about the fee on sugary drinks. There's a lot more than that to worry about. And first of all, good morning, Rep. Johanson. How are you?
Good morning, Mike. It's great to be here.
Thank you. One thing that I'd like to ask you about before we talk about things locally, I couldn't help but notice over the weekend that the ongoing presentations by the president, and not just here but in other states, are trying to show everybody how much sequestration was going to cost. Mm-hmm. Shouldn't we all be aware that, of course, it's going to cost? I mean, how else do we control spending? It is being so politicized. I don't know what to think anymore.
Well, I think what you see a lot in Washington, D.C., and I certainly saw it from my time there, is there's a lot of brinksmanship that goes on, and sometimes a wait and delay, and I don't know that that's necessarily what people are trying to do, but that's what it feels like to the American people when you think, this sounds like a story that repeats. Didn't we just talk about the impacts of sequestration? Didn't we just try
the
to
fiscal
avoid
cliff
it?
And avoid this and avoid that?
Right, or the lifting of the debt ceiling, or it's a story that repeats, and I think that's people's frustration sometimes with Washington D.C.
Isn't it? In fact, we all have to collectively agree that we can't be fiscally responsible. We got to keep kicking it down the road. We've got to do this. I mean, the president is the one, if my memory is right, that suggested sequestration in the first place. Mm-hmm. And now all of a sudden he says, if you do it, you're going against my wishes.
Well, it's an ironic twist of fate that Washington, D.C. tried to design a pill that was so bitter that we would never get to this point of having to potentially swallow it. And here we are, month after month talking about, the pill's still really bitter. We shouldn't swallow it. But, that's why I think prudent government can't always wait on everything. You got to make some of the tough choices. And that's people in both parties have to do that at the federal level, exert some leadership and really get things moving so that we're not always at the brink of something.
As a student of history, a lot of people will look back and say, look, we've been here before. I mean, we had the Great Depression in the late 20s, early 30s. Mm-hmm. We've certainly had a lot of recessions before, but we've always collectively been able to work with each other and work things out. It doesn't look as though that model is being looked after anymore.
Mm-hmm. Well, I heard a fascinating statistic the other day, and you can see it bear out. Of the 435 congressional districts that comprise the entire United States, and we have 2 of them, there are just a handful that really are swing districts. So most of them have been drawn through reapportionment and through the census data that happens every 10 years, drawn in such a way that it really favors one political party or another, which ends up meaning that really most politicians, especially in the House, are caring largely about primary battles as opposed to appealing to the broadest swath of people. And so in order to stay in office, you cater to your base, not necessarily catering towards the center.
That's really good. In other words, if you're traditionally blue, you just get as blue as you can during your campaign and claim that you're bluer than the other guy, because then in the general you get elected.
Right. And so how that bears out in terms of policy is when you get to the U.S. Capitol, all of a sudden, in order to stay there, you maintain that posture instead of trying to find that common ground in the middle. And if there's only 40-something members that actually are in the middle, that's not a whole lot of critical mass in a body of 435.
You know what I think? That in some respects, that's really not a bad idea. I mean, it depends on which side of the argument you are these days. I mean, we are pretty much divided. There seems to be some worry, though, that recently, and I want to be able to turn this locally so that we can get some calls and talk about some of these specific things that you are looking at and concerned about as we do the crossover, is that in the past there are political things and then there are things that make sense for everybody. And it seems the things that make sense for everybody are fewer and farther between.
That's true. And I think it's just, again, especially at the national level, less so. I'm happy to report on the local level. I think you actually see us bucking that trend, working together to try to get some common policies together that finds common ground and really speaks to what people want, despite some of our political
Well,
differences.
wouldn't that be because, in actual fact, because we have a mandated balanced budget, that we have to sort of roll up our sleeves and work together because most of us taxpayers are pretty akamai. I mean, we look at someone and say, what is this? This is another grab. I don't like it, or I can understand and go for that.
Right.
So, by the way, if you'd like to join the conversation, you may do that at any time. I do have a few ground rules. We don't accept email during the sessions with our when we're talking politics here with newsmakers in the studio, so you need to call us. And we don't accept off-the-air suggestions either. So if you want to talk to Rep. Johanson or ask a question, now's your chance at 296-5467. Before we go to our first break in this segment, Aaron, I want to tell you that I picked up the paper this morning and saw the yeas and the nays on the sugary drinks question. And I know that this is just but one of many things that we're going to talk about today. What is the feeling of the minority caucus and yourself personally on this sugary drink tax? Because I do know that there are some people that say, how can you not be for good health? And there are some people that say, how can you not be for government meddling?
Well, I think the bill that's moving, the governor's bill, is moving in the Senate. So we'll eventually consider that in the House when it crosses over, which is soon because we're reaching the halfway point next week, actually.
Yeah, here it comes.
I believe.
Yeah,
and so,
yeah.
But I think this is a particularly good bill to talk about for your listeners because it's endemic of conversation that doesn't go on at the legislature and what really should be, which is, to what extent does personal responsibility factor into people's lives and their decision making? And it's my belief, and I think a lot of the minority caucus's belief, that we can't legislate every single behavior, every single action, and we can't legislate people taking responsibility or not taking responsibility for themselves. And when it comes to something like the sugary beverage tax, sure, anything consumed in excess can cause obesity or associated health problems. But
well,
again,
we're seeing the parallel in New York, right, Aaron, with Mayor Bloomberg. I mean, he's out there so far that if the limb breaks, he's going to fall.
Right.
And it may cost him his life. Who knows? It may cost him his job.
Yeah, I mean, he's going after everything in New York City. But eventually, we cannot legislate everything, and that's where people have to take responsibility. And so, this is a perfect tax to talk about because there are some health problems, but I don't think they're only caused by sugary beverage consumption.
Okay, let's get Phil in here. Phil wants to know a question about the balanced budget, which I think is a wonderful thing that we have, and hopefully we can stick to it and not cost us too much. Phil, good morning.
Hey, good morning.
Morning, Phil.
So my question, and this doesn't really come from a place of, I think I know something you guys don't. I'm just really wondering about this. With our balanced budget amendment for Hawaii, does that lead us, though, to seek federal funds a lot and really kind of, put ourselves in support of a lot of bad federal policy because we need those federal funds coming that don't count against our budget as a state?
That's a really interesting question, Phil, and it's a little bit of both. Sometimes it does lead us to seek federal funds because we need that match. So you find a lot of state programs that are built off of getting a match or a bigger federal portion to leverage from the state dollars. But actually, what we've seen through the past few budget cycles where we've actually had to cut is that's not the only determinant of what state government programs stay or don't stay. So in the past few years, particularly when the economy was really bad, there were a lot of programs that were cut.
Fishing for dollars. Right?
Yeah, that got federal funding just because we couldn't even afford the state match component. So, I think at least we're lucky that because the Constitution mandates it, we have some measure of fiscal prudence. I don't know that we'd be that disciplined if we didn't have it.
Awesome. Good to hear that.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. And
but there's a lot of room for improvement.
I was going to say,
I don't want to pretend that.
Let's talk about this for a minute because we know that, for instance, with things like the seatbelt law and other speed limits and everything else, in order to be able to even qualify for federal assistance, local laws have to be
correct. They have to comport.
Yeah. So that being said, sometimes we do make a conscious effort, but some people say,
particularly for highways and airports and a lot of the big infrastructure.
Yeah.
There's a lot of federal mandates that we have to
But how many people misunderstand that the federal dollars are our dollars anyway that we sent to them in the first place? We just want some back.
That's true.
There's no way it's all going to come back, is there?
No.
Because what runs the federal programs, right? What do you say to people that say, look, isn't the fix nationally to have a balanced budget mandate in Congress?
I certainly think that has great potential. I mean, we probably wouldn't be in some of the predicaments that we're in right now if we practiced a lot more fiscal discipline at the federal level.
Okay, we're going to talk about the not just the sequestration, but maybe the local sequestration and some of the things that are happening. But right now, it's time for us to take a look at traffic with Malin Moore. You're listening to the Mike Buck Show. Representative Aaron Johanson's in the house, and we're happy to take your calls as we proceed through this segment at 296 KHNR or 296-5467.
KHNR.
Oh my goodness, what an appropriate piece of music. What's up around the bend? Well, you know, a bigger hole in your wallet if you just play ostrich or possum and you sleep through this ledge. Representative Aaron Johanson and I are talking off the air about some of the things that are going on in the big square building. As he said, we're a week away from the crossover. That means it's time for everybody to get really, really serious on what to protest or what to compliment. And because we have the balanced budget, I know a lot of this stuff that's going on, Aaron, is because of that responsibility rather than makes good sense. You were telling me off the air that this sugary drinks tax is a good example of something that's well-intentioned but may have ramifications and achieve the opposite of what it looks like trying to achieve.
Sure. I think also we as a state have to decide that we shouldn't be necessarily in the business of picking and choosing economic winners and losers. And what we do by targeting specific industries alone in a silo is basically just hurt their business and drive them out of business and pick other winners, which isn't the best or fairest tax policy. It doesn't say we're a good climate to do business in. And what's more, it hurts people's jobs and sources of income for the state.
Let me make sure that we can point out some examples. For instance, I can cite right off the fact of the High Five bill, which has put a burden on people rather than have the county or the state mandate recycling. We put it. We actually make the public do it, and then tell them the better a job you do, the more likely it's going to cost you more because it's costing us in government a lot to run the program.
Right. That's exactly what's happening now, and you see those in the bills, and it's interesting when you see colleagues scratch their heads and say, what? This doesn't make sense.
Yeah. Okay. Now that being said, many of our callers, and I'm telling you, the talk radio audience is really Akamai. That's why they listen to the format, and they say, well, look, give us some more examples, and I say that sometimes it is the very essentials that they different groups look at, saying, hey, you know what? Just by putting up the gas a penny a gallon, look what we can do for the roads. Just by putting up, let's have an education tax, only 1 penny. There are many, many people with pretty valid reasons about needing more money that are knocking on you guys' doors right now.
Well, and it's great that you bring that up. There's another one that's really going to hit people in the pockets, and one that is universal. Not everybody drinks a sugary beverage, but most people fill up gas. And there's a bill moving through the legislature right now. We just passed it out of the, or I think it moved out of the Finance Committee. I voted no on it, but it would increase the barrel tax by an unspecified amount, and to go to wildlife conservation. Again, something laudable.
Well intended. Everybody's going to get behind it. But see, here's the thing. We already can high-five nobody about having the highest gas prices in the country. So we're going to prove that by making them even higher.
Well, and there's not a lot of transparency in the tax. When you go and you fill up gas and you see, it's more expensive, and it just keeps getting more expensive, but you don't know that it's a few fractions of a penny more expensive per gallon because the legislature added additional fees onto it. It doesn't say that on the receipt. So, there's not very much transparency in the tax. And, this was a tax that originally went to cleaning up potential oil spills off of our island, post Exxon Valdez. So, there needs to be transparency in tax policy so that people out there can evaluate whether it's a policy they like or not.
One thing that people don't understand, and Lowell Kalapa from the Tax Foundation has tried to explain it, everybody's tried to explain it, that the rise in fuel costs per barrel, say, for instance, from Indonesia, wherever we're getting our crude, when it goes up, gas prices go up. But everything along it, I mean, for instance, the road tax is a fixed tax, so many pennies. But then on top of that is the GE tax.
Correct.
And the GE tax is on everything.
That's right.
And so
it's a pyramiding tax.
Yeah, I was going to say, so what happens when the oil processors tell us, well, you know what, we have no control. We've got to go up a penny a gallon. It's really not a penny. Because of the GE tax.
Yeah, incrementally it adds up all along the way. So when you get to the pump, boy, it's pretty inflated compared to what it might be.
How is that explained to you all the legislators by the Department of General, by DAGS, as far as, okay, this is what it means. This is what Council of Revenue says. This is what's coming in. Here are some ways we can to eliminate it. Isn't that what we were all about anyway?
Do you mean specifically with respect to the barrel tax?
Yeah,
or
any add-on. I mean, if we're not going to cut spending, we've got to increase revenues.
Right.
And most of these things look like, and you got some more to cite, revenue increases. There's a lot of them that we don't know about, that we don't talk about every day.
I would say that Department of Budget and Finance and Department of Taxation are fairly forthcoming, if you ask. But it's the system is set so that if you're not investigating and you're not somewhat suspicious of tax and fee increases along the way, and you don't self-educate, sometimes you can remain, and this is part of the problem at the legislature, sometimes you can remain blissfully unaware of the impact of certain tax and fee increases if you don't do some of your own digging and you don't make the logical conclusions about what is this going to do to the average family filling up at the pump or just buying supplies for a picnic. And sometimes people don't, especially because the legislature is so good at packaging things in a nice shiny wrapping paper and a bow, so you feel a little bit better about voting for something that really is just not that advantageous for people in Hawaii.
Aaron, no matter what somebody feels about sequestration, like I said earlier, President Obama has gone state by state with these pleas, talking about it. The increase and the decrease is not as great as we're being told it is. I mean, sequestration is going to hurt us all. But what sort of an additional burden does that place on the legislature this year, particularly with respect to the federal dollars that we already know, the military cutbacks that we've been threatened with? That means that the Council on Revenues is going to have to come up with a very quick rethink of what's coming in.
Right, and they will be coming back with another forecast. It's significant for Hawaii because we are largely dependent on not just tourism but also on the defense industry. And I know this acutely since my district surrounds Pearl Harbor. But it's a lot of civilians that are employed there as well as military personnel. And because we need that, certainly sequestration definitely has the potential to affect our economy. And I think that's something that, sitting on the Finance Committee as a vice chair, I know that's something that Chair Luke is concerned with and something that she's been thinking about. And that's why she's trying to take a fairly conservative approach when it comes to the budget and not overinflating it like some people might want to do this time of perceived plenty.
What some seem to be worried about, and I'm in that cadre of people saying, look, we already know that we're going to get whacked by the Fed. So what we've got to do is figure out how to increase revenues. And one of the tastiest morsels out there is to increase the cost and fees on our visitors, on our tourists. And I do know that this increase on the TAT, which we thought was going to go away, is still very much alive.
Yeah, it's not necessarily an increase over the present rate, but it would be a permanent extension of this higher rate than it was a few years ago.
We were told that was going to be temporary. Have you, in your experience, because I never have, and I've been a little longer in the tooth in some of these areas than others, is I've never seen something temporary go away. It's always been either kept or replaced.
Yeah, that's a pretty safe mantra at the legislature. Just because something enabling legislation is passed with a repeal date doesn't mean that repeal date is going to stick. Yeah,
and so what you may think of, and when we come back, we'll talk about the increase in the GET for transportation in Oahu County. Is that ever going to go away? I'm not really sure it is. By the way, we're getting a lot of email, but unable to receive them during this segment with Rep. Johanson. If you want to make a comment or ask a question, you're going to have to do that live. And you can do that by calling the 296-KHNR or 296-5467. We are at our 7:30 report. Representative Aaron Johanson is in the house, and we're here to talk more about what's happening and how you can get in touch with your legislator, your representative, even your city council person on stuff that's important. 7:30, we'll be right back. Oh, once again, a little piece of appropriate music called The Heat Is On. Well, the heat is on. As a matter of fact, not that they turn the air conditioning down at this time of the year in the big square building, but the heat is on. It's time for our legislators, our elected officials, to do the right thing, to figure out how to run our state with the money that we've got, and now not to further encumber our ability to have a happy and productive and hopefully prosperous lifestyle without them grabbing more of our money. Representative Aaron Johanson is here, and we're talking about some of these things in the crossover. And before the break, Aaron, we were talking specifically about the well-intended increases in certain things, which come sort of as a mandate. Are there any bills, other than what we've already talked, that are looking like happening without anybody in the public even knowing about it? I'm talking about some more of these revenue increases. I know that this is something that you really bird dog.
I think one that comes to mind, because we've seen this in finance and haven't voted on it yet, is a plastic bag fee.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of these little sort of life essentials that the legislature starts to look at and target. And what would happen under this bill is at least some of the money would be returned to the business. And there are this bill is better than some of the plastic bag or single-use checkout bag fees that I've seen. It's not something I support. But at least there are exemptions for those who are needy. But it's another, get you at the pump, get you, in the grocery line, in addition to the already high taxes and fees that we levy in general, whether it's on income taxes or, just daily life essentials.
With regards to that, I mean, somebody did the math for us, and I'm always amazed at how this audience reacts. They say, if you use the number $1 million as the taxpayers, and I know there aren't $1 million, there are less than $1 million, but if you use the number $1 million in Hawaii, that particular bill would be $37 a year for you. And if you had 4 taxpayers, you'd be spending, close to $200 a year on plastic bag fees. That becomes more real to people. And yet, isn't this a great example on how it's well intended? I mean, we need to protect the birds and the bees and the forest and the trees. So let's say this and take that. But we just also looked at, Aaron, as money being skimmed off retirement funds and everything. What would be a stop to that? I mean, for that money to be used for something other than what they say the tax increase is.
Well, I think the unfortunate byproduct of having various raids on different funds is, sometimes you find those funds low, and you find our employee retirement system as well as our employee union trust fund, which is the health benefits plan. Both of those are significant liabilities and significant unfunded liabilities. And unfortunately, what we've seen is greater attention paid to it, which is helpful, actually. And this is a general point, I think, for all the listeners out there. The more attention paid to something, the less likely legislators are likely to do something controversial or something that contravenes the general will of the public about it. So, I don't know that you will see some of the same types of raids to the employee retirement system or any of those kinds of things anymore, because people just know that there's a huge unfunded liability out there that really weighs down our bond rating and weighs down the ability for the state to get things done, because it's just this massive sort of albatross.
Yeah, and that being said, let's talk specifically about some other practical things. Like, for instance, we get to a point where we are tilt. There are many that say, okay, with the federal money going down and the tourist money going up, let's talk about maybe legislating stiffer penalties for people that try and interfere with tourists. As an example, we have this horrible thing that happened on Maui the other day, where some people got, forced to spend the night in the bushes, and one of them died. And then when they get back to the parking lot, their cars have been ripped off. I mean, you talk about the goose that laid the golden egg, right? Does that ever come across anybody's mind that maybe we ought to be a little bit more mindful of law enforcement?
It does, and I think people recognize that tourism can't just be viewed in a silo. It's a holistic experience that we have to ensure all of our laws are keeping up to date with. And if there's anything that Mike McCartney, the CEO of the HTA, the Hawaii Tourism Authority, regularly and I think very articulately conveys, is that this has to be a positive destination and a whole positive experience for people. Otherwise, they will choose a lower price point where they can get some of the same things for less money.
Yeah, that's a great point. As a matter of fact, way back when Mike McCartney was a state senator, I remember that there was a great deal of kudos going into the private sector for their recognizing the importance of imparting the culture of old Hawaii and the aloha spirit to their employees. And that's still going on. I mean, the private sector does a lot about that, especially the hotels. But what about the areas in the neighborhoods where some of these perpetrators come from, maybe being a little more proactive at the school level, saying, hey, you know what, maybe you think it might be cool to rip off tourists, but you're ripping off yourself.
Well, and it's all tied together. You just touched on it there, that if if we're not doing the best job possible at making sure people have opportunity, whether it's educational, starting out as kids, whether it's economic, once they get to be adults, then we're going to continue to have certain social ills that manifest themselves, whether it's with respect to tourists and the tourism market or other types of criminal behavior. And it's it's all one system that
Here comes a great one. And even though I say I don't take things off the air, I'm not going to read this person's question, but I sort of knew this was coming. Let's talk about early education. Mm-hmm. And what we've been told is, look, we need to do this. We need to spend a lot of money doing this to make the playing field level. There's a lot of thought in that because, if we don't start telling our kids at a very young age mm-hmm. Some of the things that they learn bad habits on, then we are at risk. Mm-hmm. And yet, it looks like this impending legislature would cost a lot of money that maybe we don't have.
Oh, it's a very expensive signature issue of the governor's, and I think that's not lost on the legislature at all because we're not necessarily in a time of plenty. There's a perception that there's more than used to be, but I wouldn't call it a time of plenty. And whether it's that initiative or the others, they're expensive. Now, I think, while it certainly brings up a valid premise for us all to consider, how do we increase access to education? There's a lot of detail-oriented questions that have to be answered. What happens if the government is subsidizing something? What happens then to all those people who aren't receiving the subsidy? Do you just sort of drive different providers in and out of the market? One of the issues that's actually been brought up by some of the members of my caucus with the early learning program as currently drafted, if you're a religious institution and a preschool, you might not necessarily be encompassed by the governor's program.
So you get no money.
Yeah, unless you excise every element that might have to do with some of your core founding principles out of the curriculum. So one of our representatives, Representative McDermott, asked different questions about what if a nun is wearing a habit? Well, technically they're not supposed to be wearing a habit if they're receiving money for this. So just impractical things like that are also things that need to be addressed in this bill that still have some details to be worked out.
We're getting a fair bit of feedback from people who are saying, hey, look, what about that category of parents that are putting their kids in parochial schools, in religious, faith-based learning institutions or private institutions of any kind that aren't happy with the public education results with the majority kids. So now these very people might be affected by that legislation because those schools aren't going to get any of that. So what's going to happen is, with my cost as a parent goes up, I can't send my kid to that school anymore because I can't afford to do both.
Well, as currently drafted, the schools, I think the Attorney General's testimony would say that the schools are eligible so long as they excise out any kind of religious aspect. But, how
which is hard. How, if that's why my school is open. How do I excise that out?
I mean, I have a great preschool provider in my district in IAEA, the IAEA Honganji. But, it's a church. It's a mission. So how do you, excise that completely out of the realm of the preschool?
It's interesting because, the separation of church and state, which has been so footballed around of late, is now coming back into the picture, saying, "See, this is a great example why you can't you can't allow somebody that is faith-based to have anything to do with something that's supposed to be not faith-based."
Well, and I think one of the larger issues inherent here in this early learning program of the governor's is, to what extent should the government be subsidizing things, in the private sector, and how do we really improve education? And I think there's legitimate concerns that we should also be focusing on the improvement and refining of K through 12, where we've certainly got some room to grow, rather than just targeting, really early on with the kids.
Do you think that there will be renewed interest in some of these revenue-producing bills now that we've been told or scared to death about, wow, the sequestration is going to take so many federal dollars out of us, we had better increase revenue because we don't know how to decrease spending. What do you think about decreased spending? Is there anything that's being legislated to stop the spending?
Well, I think there are proposals to stop spending. Now, do they ever see the light of day? I'm not really sure in terms of the legislatures actually approving some of these bills. But what I will tell you is I know, both from serving on finance and I also know the WAM chair as well, the Senate Ways and Means chair. And lots of people are not getting the kinds of requests that they want, and certain programs are not being approved because they're too costly. So while we don't necessarily see a whole lot of bills that specifically aim to restrict spending, because most legislators would say that's the prerogative of the legislature to determine that, we don't need a law to dictate our behavior. Sometimes I think we do.
Yeah,
but,
I agree.
I don't know that I have a agreement from my colleagues, but where they typically try to achieve some measure of fiscal prudence is through the budgeting, crafting the budget, and the budget is usually not including as much as most people want.
Do you think that in some respects the administration is sugarcoating the warm and fuzzy feeling? Things are really rolling now. We're back on track. I mean, we're balancing our budget, and so let's take some of these funds that now seem to be extra and do this and do that for. It doesn't look to me like we have anything extra.
I think what we're hoping is that the positive economic forecasts, again, I underscore that it's forecasts, it's not actual tangible revenue, are positive. So there's reason to be slightly optimistic. I would say cautiously optimistic, but it's not actual revenue and it hasn't materialized yet. So we can't be sure, which is why we need to be, like that squirrel in winter and make sure that we have things stored away in case things aren't as rosy as forecasted.
Yeah, we got to get a few more Hawaiian Hawks to take a good look at this thing. We're going to come back and look at some of these specific bills. And by the way, if you have got something that you've been looking at and don't think it's getting enough attention, you still have time to reach us. I really wish I could open the email. You guys are getting trained to do that. Please call live when we have Rep. Johanson here, because we don't want to be ever accused of stacking the deck and try to make you swallow something because you think it. You know what I'm getting at? So 296-5467 is how you do that. Mail in more, takes a look at traffic. We come back with more right after this.
KHNR.
Yeah, we try to get a little bit of happiness into these deals. I don't want poor Aaron Johanson to think every time we come here we got to talk about, let's feel collectively how miserable we can feel this morning.
It's not all doom
yeah,
and
no,
gloom.
it's not. So, and I do want to close the segment today by talking about some of the things that people, how they can react, how they can respond. But there are some good things that are happening. Let's talk about some of the things that seem to be getting, bipartisan support that are looking good for us.
Sure. I mean, I think there's a lot of credit that needs to go out to the new leadership teams in both the Senate and particularly in the House as well, that there are significantly more good government, increased transparency and accountability measures that are moving through that heretofore just weren't. So whether it's with respect to ethics reform or campaign spending, or even with respect to ballot integrity and the successful prosecution of elections, these are some really good government mechanisms that I think make our government more transparent and more accountable to the people. And that's something that's a wonderful byproduct of this new coalition. And really, I think an embrace by Speaker Suki to try to embrace all 51 members' ideas that some of these ideas just have traction and they're moving along.
How about this? There's a couple of things that come to mind on this, and that is some of these bills that are obviously revenue-oriented. Some people are saying, look, you know what? We're taking about as much as we can from the golden cow. There's just not any more ways that we can get reelected if we keep taking more money from the people that are voting for us. So how about let's look at spending? Do you think that that's why some of this ethics reform and some of this waste, some of these bills that are to do with audits are important? Because we probably are collecting enough money. We're just leaking.
Yes. I think it's always healthy to be continually reassessing and reviewing different functions of government and how we're performing. And there is a lot of room to improve some of our current mechanisms, whether it's with respect to procurement or effective delivery of service. There's been a lot of scrutiny of different DOE contracts that some of them have just been hemorrhaging money, whether it's the school bus contracts or other things. And I think that is healthy, and that's what's needed to alleviate some of the burden on our overtaxed taxpayers.
We have had one example lately of there being some concern or some eye-opening with regards to bidding and things at the university. And that there's some that are saying, well, that pleasure probably at one point in time made a lot of sense because that's the university, so who better look after what their requirements are than them? So there's some people in the Senate and I guess in the House that are looking, hey, wait a minute, maybe DAGs ought to be doing everything and not having these other groups doing their own searching, their own bidding.
Yeah, and I think, I certainly don't want to give away any state secrets, but I think you're going to see that in the next few days at the House, particularly trying to achieve some greater oversight and accountability for the University of Hawaii and its procurement and spending.
Okay, now there's a couple of things, like I said, we don't, do email on, but I know what some of the concerns are, and without giving specific questions from specific listeners. Let's talk about two other things quickly. And one is that what, if anything, left, or what shreds or shards of anything to do with gambling are left? And what, if anything, there seems to be renewed interest in at least some plan on the legalization of small amounts of marijuana.
Well, on both, there are less and less windows of opportunity for proponents of either of these measures, particularly on gambling. Almost all the gambling bills are dead. The only reason I would say that there might be a small chance is there are certain bills that would allow, that would allow sort of
what we talked about last year,
on,
gutting.
Yeah.
Taking a bill and taking it that
right.
generally said something and have it specifically said
so
something.
there are still a lot of measures out there relating to economic development that might be able to serve as a vehicle for gambling. I just don't think that there's the collective will in the legislature to pass that. And on the marijuana side, it didn't move out of the Judiciary Committee, so I think in terms of recreational marijuana use and the legalization thereof, you're just not going to see
Do you
it.
think sometimes, Aaron, that some of these legislators, whether it be House or Senate, when they know something's not about to make it, they're going to say something that would all of a sudden endear them to a large slice of the voting population? In other words, let's say that just under 50% of people were for marijuana, and yet just over were not, so that most legislators would respond to the majority and say, well, we're not ready for this. But 49% of people are, so at least I can get them on the next vote.
Yeah, and you got a lot of populists in the building. Sometimes it's boring to be the pragmatic policymaker who tries to be reasoned, but it certainly makes it interesting when you have colleagues who realize 49% of the people are for this. I'm going to go out and beat the drums and the bandwagon and get a cheering squad behind me. And
70-30 be a lot easier to deal with, right?
Yeah. But I mean, that's a part of politics, and some people are just built that way.
What about legislators being, impressed by or rejected by another state doing it? I know that a lot of people say, well, I don't care what they do in California. This is not California. But yet some of these states are, slowly but surely gathering some moss with gun control, with marijuana, with gay marriage, with a lot of other things. How often does that come up and say, well, look, they're doing it here and doing it there. Why shouldn't we?
Yeah, when I was in college, I think that one of the things I took away from our intro to psych class was this concept of cognitive dissonance. And if I've ever seen a place that was a master at cognitive dissonance, it's the Hawaii State Legislature. So when it comes to looking at other states' examples, if it makes the case for your bill, people are more than happy to cite it.
Sure.
But if it contravenes what your bill wants to do and precedent being set through other states, certainly we're different. We don't need to pay attention to them. So I think you got a lot of good people at the Capitol and a lot of people who are very good at rationalizing and bolstering their argument in whatever way they want it to go.
Is that sort of coming out of Hollywood? We've refrained on purpose from talking about the Oscars this morning, but we do know that the violence in movies, the patent movies are good, and yet they seem to be in Hollywood for gun control, and yet they use guns as part of their makeup as far as getting people to go to movies.
Yeah, I think if you're going to look at analyzing any problem, you have to look at all of the root causes. And almost all problems are multifaceted. There isn't usually a singular cause for one problem.
Okay, at this time of the year, and we're certainly glad to do this, we need people to know how they can best use their voice, how they can find out what's happening with some of these bills. How can they do that? And more importantly, how can they respond to your district? How can people respond to you?
Sure. You definitely need to be looking at what's in the news, consuming news voraciously, but call your legislators and ask them or email them what's going on. This is my particular issue. I care about this. Update me. You don't have to know the bill number. Just ask about a general issue. It's our job to provide that information to you. And not enough people, quite frankly, do that. So they end up getting surprised when different things pass in May and become law because maybe their legislator didn't necessarily apprise them of it. But if you demand answers from us, that's our job to give it to you. So I'd say be active, be vocal, just regularly be in touch. I find that helpful when my constituents
it's pretty easy. By the way, when you see a bill pertaining to, and there's a blue line, if you click it, you'll find out. It says it says referring to this, but my goodness, what's that?
Yeah.
And there's a lot more of that coming up. And when exactly is the crossover? Is it this Friday? Or soon? I know it's very soon.
It's either at the end of this week or actually, the crossover would be in the middle to end of next week. So we'll have our all-day floor session. We'll see a flurry of bills on Tuesday. So I think it's either Wednesday or Thursday.
Okay, so this next Monday, we'll be able to give people some last-minute instructions on what they better do quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. That's great. Thanks very much, Aaron, for being with us.
My pleasure.
When we come back, we get back into these stories of the day. We got a bunch of national stories we're looking at.